No, I mean you can say my name, and
Yeah, I
your
can't say
host
it properly.
Erwan.
Erwan?
It's
Erwan?
easy. No,
Erwan?
but let's take it back a sec. Can you say Air Force One?
Air Force One.
Remove the force.
Air One.
Say it fast.
Air One.
Yeah, close enough.
Air One. So
Erwan.
it's not Wan, it's one.
Erwan.
Air
Erwan.
One.
Yeah.
Air One. Air One.
Erwan.
Air Juan. Air Juan.
Erwan. Just say it like
You gotta,
that.
you
It's
gotta, you
fine.
gotta, you gotta like pronounce it from the back of your throat. It's all
Erwan. All right.
right, all
We're
right,
good.
no problem. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Network and Podcast. I am one of your amazing co-host duo here, Bruce Wallace, and my fellow co-host Erwan James is on board, ready to go, ready to fire. Now,
Ready to rock and roll, baby.
this is going to be a little bit different. This is the first episode of a new series we're calling Best Effort. So this is going to be less focused around news and what's happening in our industry, and is really going to be around just random topics that we kind of want to shoot the shit on, have a discussion. Hopefully it's interesting. If not, maybe you can, like, I don't know, double the playback speed or something to make it more interesting. In either case, our friend Erwin here has a topic for us today. I don't know what it is, and we're just going to talk about it. So,
All
so
right.
take over. What's the topic?
The topic is openness.
Openness.
That's
Okay.
it. Yeah. Okay. Give me some credit. So I went out for dinner with some friends maybe like 2-3 weeks ago, and we started talking about the use of the term open, and this actually came up from, as you may be familiar with, Bruce. Not sure if you are, but the recent announcement from Nokia and their latest data center network operating system, SR Linux, and I had some friends watch the announcement. And I guess the term open was used either verbally or written. I'm not too sure where it was used. And
Probably
that
both.
kind of probably both. Yeah. So that prompted a discussion with this friend of mine, whom actually I noticed had commented on LinkedIn or commented somewhere about the usage of the term open. And he seemed rather offended that, that a vendor operating system or a vendor solicited message may use the term open. And so that prompted our discussion over dinner, which turned into not a heated discussion, but a fairly good discussion around the use of term. And I guess from his standpoint, he felt like people were misusing it. It was a marketing thing. There was some confusion around open versus open source, and what does open really mean? Is it just used for marketing, or does it actually have a meaning, especially in the context of networking? So this being the networking podcast, we're going to try and keep it focused around anything that has to do with networking and the term open, and maybe some other related terms, and maybe some better terminologies that we could adopt as an industry if open's not the right word and the right message. So that's the premise, and I just thought that due to that discussion being fairly interesting. By the way, at that same dinner, I had a third friend there who thought the discussion was completely boring, and we were just trolling each other. So it's very possible that this discussion with you turns into nothing more than banter and trolling as opposed to meaningful. But anyway, I thought it could be interesting.
Okay, well, that's the point of the series anyway. It's all about banter.
That's
And
true.
it's all about trolling.
That's true.
So,
This best effort series is about us literally just shooting the shit and talking about things. So this could be completely just banter, which hopefully it is actually, because that is the point. Yeah.
yeah, if you're hoping to hear anything intelligent today, you might want to adjust your
Yeah. Just turn
expectations
off.
now.
Just turn it off right now.
Okay.
Okay.
All
Where
right.
do we start,
So
though?
I think there's a few areas to this, right? The open versus open source. I mean, we have to talk about that, of course.
Yep.
There's this whole white box movement where we have hardware and software disaggregation. I guess there's an openness angle to that. So
Yep.
we'll maybe have a little bit of a discussion around that. And I guess there's a bunch of open source noses out there, and there's also a bunch of noses that consider themselves open via northbound interfaces, right? So
Right.
data models and open config and all that good stuff. And I guess we could have a discussion around if that's enough, if that's really open, or it needs to go further. And there's also noses like you would have seen from Nokia with their SR Linux launch that like to talk about kind of SDK-like interfaces that provide some level of extensibility and maybe that's another angle for openness.
Well, that actually came up as kind of like extensible versus open, and is there a difference? If you have an extensible platform or an extensible, is having something as simple as an API available to do something, does that imply openness to some extent, where you're allowing something else to control a device or something else to make changes or retrieve information, So that was part of the discussion, right? So I don't know where we started.
Okay.
You want to start at the hardware angle, like, because there has been a push from a hardware perspective. There actually has been, there is open hardware where the schematics and all the related mini pack, right, is all open, and anybody can go and get that built. And so there is that. And what does that mean? Is that equivalent to open source though? Or do we have a differentiation between open source hardware and open hardware?
Okay. Well, I do think the fact there's open and there is open source, right? There are two distinct things in my mind, because I don't know what that distinction is necessarily. I don't know if I can like summarize that into words nicely, but okay, let's start with hardware. Let's start with hardware, because then we can table the open source thing and I can think about it for a little bit.
Sounds good.
So open hardware. I guess there's two angles to this, right? If we look at the server world, would we consider server hardware and generalized compute to be open hardware? I guess I would pose that question first. So because I can kind of rip off, the cover of my server, and I can see a motherboard, and, there's a bunch of different vendors that all make their own motherboards and CPU complexes. I mean, they typically come from Intel or AMD, or I guess there's manufacturers building ARM CPUs now. But would you consider those designs open? You can't find the schematics, right?
Exactly. So I wouldn't consider it open, personally, because exactly, you're not going to go find the schematics and get that motherboard built yourself, and you may not be, you're not going to be able to take it and then make changes to it. But it does have some openness to it, in the sense that, like, you can put an AMD or an Intel CPU. You have a decision in how you're going to build that server. So there's a decision-making process and some extensibility or customizability to the hardware as a server as a whole, right? Like what you're actually going to put in. But I'm not sure I would consider that open though. That naturally I would say that's not open, because that's kind of, I've never actually thought about it that way, and it seems like that's kind of been the de facto for so long. You can build PCs with a bunch of different parts and then include servers, and
okay, so
that status quo is maybe not open. I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking, you and I both are avid gamers, so we both have gaming computers, and I picked all the parts in my computer and pieced them all together, decided what I was going to buy, and I had a bunch of different decisions, both in terms of different vendors, Intel versus AMD, and AMD versus NVIDIA being the obvious ones, but there's a bunch of different memory vendors out there, and they're all building to reference specs, right? Like, DDR4 from one vendor is going to look the same as DDR4 from another. The pin layout is going to be the same. Maybe the timings are slightly different, and so on and so forth. But so the specifications that these manufacturers are building to are open per se. So
True.
I guess if you go down enough layers, something needs to be open in order for there to be that kind of implied choice, I think.
Right.
Maybe it's just at a level lower than we typically operate at, right?
Yeah.
So, all right. Now, I don't want us to get derailed in what is open necessarily, because I think it's entirely subjective. I think in some cases, people would consider the Linux kernel to not be open, right? And that's a bit of an oxymoron, because it is open source.
How would you consider that not open?
I mean, is GPL an open license?
Yeah.
I mean, the way people get away, like if you look at NOS vendors, right? Let's break that down a little bit. If you look at NOS vendors that are running like a Linux kernel under the hood, the only way they're allowed to do that is either by doing everything in user space and not touching the kernel. Like there's this huge debate around, are you allowed to package the Linux kernel as part of a closed source operating system? Right. And the eventual outcome was, yes, you can, so long as you are using it as a component within the system. And the idea was that if you're just making syscalls and you're not modifying the kernel in any way, then life's good. And and we've seen some people even go further and actually like modify the kernel. But I don't know, like is that legal?
Legal? I mean, legal? Like, you mean actually legal? Or are you saying like,
No, I mean
you
like
don't mean, you literally mean legal? Is that legal to do?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, clearly it
I
is,
mean,
right? I'm sure there's some
yeah.
loophole there, but
Yeah.
yeah, I would argue that the Linux kernel is open source, but it's licensed in such a way that, one person has full control over it. So it's not really that open. I mean, you could take it and extend it, but your ability to then sell or commercialize that product is limited, right?
Yeah, but the fact that you can sell it or not sell it should not be a determining factor as to whether something is open or not. If I can use it in a non-commercial way, and I can make whatever changes I want to it and use it however I want to, seems to me like that should mean it's open.
Okay.
Now,
Even
I think
without having access to the source code? So what if you just wanted to take the kernel and use all the syscalls? Would you consider that to be open? So the kernel is providing an abstraction layer towards hardware for you. It's dealing with all the kind of low-level hardware interactions, but you have full access to make syscalls. Is that open?
I mean,
or is
no,
the fact
but
it's open source what makes it open?
yeah, I think the fact that it's open source so it makes the kernel specifically open. Yeah.
Okay, so by your definition,
Because otherwise
anything
you're
that's
not
open source is open.
Yeah, anything that's open source to me is open. Yeah. To me, anything that's open source is automatically open.
Even if it's licensed in such a way that you can't change it or do anything with it other than look at the source code.
No, because you're saying you're saying is if it's open source, I automatically can make changes to it.
Not necessarily, not legally. I mean, you can,
No,
but
no. You're saying from a commercial standpoint, I can't sell what are the changes I've made to it. That's different than I can go and make changes to it and use it however I want on my personal computer or in my own lab and play with it.
I think with most licenses, that's correct. I'm sure there are licenses that prohibit making changes to open source code.
But then what's the point? I mean, why would you open source something like that? What would be the purpose?
I
There would
mean,
be no purpose.
there's a transparency angle to it, right? Kind of one of the touted benefits of open source is that I can go look at the code and spot issues with it. And if 100 people can go look at the code, they can see how things are working and spot potential security issues and then send pull requests to a maintainer. That's one of the big benefits of open source, right? Is that you have so many eyes looking at the code.
I just feel like a big aspect of it also is the fact that you can pull it down, clone it, and make your own changes to it. I mean, I would say if you had something that was open source on which you could not make changes, I would say that's not open. Maybe that's the crux, is that whether or not I can actually do something with it.
This is good. So we're breaking it down a little bit in that open, at least to you, I'm sure people listening might disagree, but open to you means if it's open source and you can make changes to that source code, that qualifies as open for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So source code really is just an interface to something else, right? Like C++ is an abstraction over another set of languages, which is an abstraction over another set of languages. So if you don't see the underlying code that C++ is calling, is it still open?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's good. That's a good answer. So now replace C++ with an API. Yeah. And I'll ask the same question. So if the API is open source, right? But the underlying calls that API is making are not, is it still open?
I mean, it's tricky. I mean,
oh, you see where I'm going, huh?
leading
I'm leading the witness.
Yes. Right? Yeah, no, I understand what you're doing. It depends what you're trying to accomplish. I think C++ is a program. I mean, it's abstracting a bunch of stuff, but you can do. I mean, the amount of stuff you can do on a blank slate with C++. I mean, just a wide range of applications that you can develop using a programming language is astronomical. And so, but you're comparing it to an API, which inherently, in most cases, is a much narrower use case and focus point. And so it's not exact. I don't think the comparison
But you could argue that the Linux kernel syscalls, that's an API, right?
Yeah, those are. That's fine. But the Linux kernel is a lot more than just that.
No, for sure. So you think the scope matters? You think the scope matters?
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is I don't think where you were going is not a good comparison. In other words, a programming language making lower level calls and providing a sort of abstraction layer to lower level actual computational functions is not equivalent to an API, which has a more narrow focus. And especially if you're then going to extrapolate that to, which I think is where you were heading, to something available to a network operating system and
I
the
wasn't
APIs.
heading anywhere.
You
I'm
were definitely
innocent
heading
here.
there. No, you were definitely heading that way. I don't think it's a fair comparison. I just think that the way that was heading is not. You can't draw side to side comparisons.
It's fair, and you always have access to the underlying machine code if you want to get that deep, right? So it is.
If you wanted to, you could. Yeah.
It's definitely not a entirely fair comparison. So you're in your mind then, open and open source are synonyms, not synonyms, because that's not a word.
No. I would say like anything that's open source is open, but anything that's open is not necessarily open source. So there is like I still think you can have an open, because now, okay, here we're talking about software specifically. If you're talking about open source software, and we started with hardware, but we skipped over that very quickly. So let's not go back to it because we've moved on. But you're talking about open source software, and that inherently is, to me, is open. But an open system or an open architecture or an open platform does not necessarily need to be open source. It depends what you're allowing the people or the consumers of this platform or system or to do, which maybe they weren't able to do before, or maybe that they are within a box, which
a box. I like boxes.
I'm trying to think of like how to word it properly.
No, I mean it's tough, right? It's tough. Like if you were to define open and remove open source, everything that's open source is open by your original definition. So what is it? What is like something tangible that you define as being open that's not open source?
Yeah. So I think like you could have potentially, and this comes back to the original discussion which I had, was having a network operating system that could be considered open but not open source. So the network operating system is made up of a whole bunch of stuff, right? There's an underlying, in a lot of cases nowadays, there's an underlying operating system that's Linux based. It doesn't have to be, and it hasn't historically always been, but lately it seems to be where people are heading. And then there's a bunch of applications that are run that are built by someone, and it could be a network vendor with closed source applications, your BGP application, your OSPF application, whatever it may be. And then you can have some network operating systems which are completely open source, which have all that, like, we take like Sonic, for instance, where everything's open source. All the applications that run are themselves in open source. But you could still have a network operating system where it's considered open in that a consumer of the network operating system can go and make a level of changes which maybe they historically weren't able to make before, and they don't have to consume necessarily the vendor or the closed system components. So let's take, for example, the ability to take a network operating system which is, let's quote it, quote unquote, open, and then runs a bunch of closed source applications, but you may be able to go in there as a consumer of this network operating system and, first of all, not use the closed source software if you didn't want to, replace it with something else, with an open source version of the same function that application provides. That to me would be open, as a consumer, I have a choice to go and do something. I can consume the closed software that's on it. I can install other closed source software on this same platform and have a same functionality, which is provide network operating system functionality, like a standard network operating system has network protocols. So I could go and, for instance, put another closed operating system, network operating system protocol like BGP stack on there, or an open one like FR, for instance. That, to me, if you provide that capability to someone, you're providing an open system, an open platform.
So
that
the
allows,
underlying OS, which, as you said, is predominantly Linux these days, actually gets you a lot of the way to being open.
Exactly.
As long as you don't try and hide it.
Correct. Exactly.
I think that's pretty fair. And Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. No. I was gonna say that was the crux of in the argument or discussion I had over dinner. That was the crux of my my point was that, the fact that you could do that to me means that you can use the term open in describing that functionality of a network operating system, is that capability, that if you wanted to go in and make changes to the system arbitrarily that you decided you wanted to make, you wanted to replace with your own software or someone else's software, you could potentially do that, right?
Okay. So I guess the main issue here then is likely that vendors that are advertising their network operating systems as open, that's not what they mean, though, is it?
Correct.
In a lot of cases, they won't allow you to do that. So there are some that
from a support perspective,
Linux,
mostly. Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
And that was the other side of it, was that his point, my friend's point, was that, this is all a marketing gimmick. Vendors will say that they have an open operating system, but if you then go and actually try and do something, that's not what they mean. They mean probably more something closer to extensible versus open. They're not actually going to let you go and do what I just described, because it won't be a supported model. And maybe in most cases, technically, you can't even do that. So what do they really mean by open, right?
Yeah. So I guess that would require vendors to support the individual applications running on the system as opposed to managing the system like an appliance, right? Because that would be the model that you would need to get into in order to support that properly. Like you would have pieces that you would consider infrastructure applications, and you support those independently of the protocol stack, because you could in theory take away the protocol stack.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have seen that happen a little bit, right? Like I believe Arista, you can run on an Arista operating system, you can run FR, right? So you can take like an open source. I believe you can. I don't think it's widely advertised, but I believe that it has been done for a certain
customer.
A certain customer. I believe it has been done. So I think but again, it may not be advertised as such. And so if you go right now and try it, it would be rather complicated to implement unless they provided you with a very simple guide in doing so. And realistically, would they support it for the wider market? Probably not. But maybe, I don't know. I think they've done it. I think that for a certain customer, they may have implemented something like that.
Okay, so to come full circle, because I want to make sure we don't belabor this point too much. But
yeah,
your definition of open is that the operator has some level of control of taking or leaving or modifying the system that is provided to them, and doesn't need to be open source. And as we're saying, having a Linux base gets you a lot of the way there, unless you're going to go and hide
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and what if I wanted to install an application on my network operating system that was completely had nothing to do with networking, right? But I wanted to consume that hardware for some other purpose, and I wanted to install, I don't know, I'm making this up completely, the MySQL database for whatever reason. That was something that I absolutely needed on my top of rack switches.
Yep.
Just providing that capability and allowing that to happen is one aspect of being open, I would say.
Yeah.
So we talked about network applications. That's one thing, but just having it, and that's where that falls into the having a Linux-based operating system as getting you 90% of the way there. I mean, that fact makes it open. Now, of course, whether vendors support that or not is another aspect of making it open. Because if I say that we can do that technically and I claim it as open, that's one thing. But then if you go and call my TAC and they say, why did you install MySQL? It's breaking everything. Then remove it. Then that's not very open, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think an okay response for you in that case would be, well, we don't support MySQL, but it looks like the underlying operating system is functioning perfectly fine, and it's just that MySQL is, I don't know, sucking all the air out of the room. Maybe you don't implement C groups or something, so there's no resource isolation, and MySQL is going nutty, and that's causing a problem. So
yeah.
I like the definition. I think I agree with it. It's not often that we would agree on something like this, I think, but
that's true.
I do like the definition where, typically the way we consume NOS is almost like a monolithic appliance, right? Like that's the model that we've kind of grown up with. That's how things have been done.
That's how they were built. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But we have kind of steered away from that a little bit. Like I know Arista lets you run applications on their system. I don't know the support model necessarily, but it seems like they have an SDK and they allow you to launch stuff. So Nokia do as well. They have an SDK and they allow you to run applications. I think
Cisco,
iOS,
I think also
XR,
Cisco does. Yeah.
Yep. And I think maybe they require you to run it in a virtual machine or something to give some of that separation. But it seems all the NOS vendors are providing something akin to, whether we want to call it extensibility or whether we want to call it, take it or leave it. Maybe because the other part of your definition was the ability to say, I don't like your closed source BGP stack, and I'm going to rip that out and run mine.
Yeah.
Now, you gave Arista as an example. I don't think Cisco lets you do that.
Don't think so. I've never heard of it, but to be fair, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah. So yeah, I like it. I like the definition. When you have full control over the operating system and you can either consume it as it is or modify it, you can take bits out, you can add bits in. I would consider that an open operating system in that you kind of have control of what's running. Now, that doesn't mean the applications that your NOS vendor is providing to you need to be open in order for the operating system to qualify as being open by that definition, right?
Exactly, which is exactly where the crux was, because I think there was, there's been this kind of overuse of the term open, I think, and then there's been a lot of like people who are interpreting that as meaning open source, and that was, coming back again to this discussion I had, I felt like when I was talking to my friend that he had automatically kind of made the assumption that something that was open and advertised as such in marketing meant that he should be able to go look at the source code for these things somewhere, right?
And you disagree with him vehemently, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I did. Yes, absolutely. And actually, there was another, following some of the social media conversations around, and again, this was all related to that Nokia SR Linux announcement and launch. I was following some of that stuff on Twitter, the conversation, and it was another acquaintance of mine that I made a comment about, hey, where can I find the source code? And it was a bit, tongue in cheek. They were trying to point out the same thing that that there was this advertisement about being open, and then he made this comment, where can I go find the source code for this, right? And now, I replied back in the same manner saying, open doesn't mean open source, and so there's nothing open source about some of these specifics of the network operating system, but it is an open operating system in other regards, right?
I see. All right. So if you stay with us this long, we've deciphered it. World hunger has been solved. Open does not mean open source.
And we're done. There you go. That's how it goes.
All right. Let's move on. I don't want us to spend too long talking about open source, because there's some other things that we could talk about.
Sure.
Other angles for openness, right? So I actually don't think it's worth talking about hardware too much. There's OCP designs for hardware now. I think by most definitions of the word, those designs are open. This whole hardware software disaggregation, some people would argue that is open, and that's mainly riding on the whole x86 Linux wave, right? It's because we now have this kind of normalized architecture and this normalized kernel that we're running. That means you can kind of rip and replace the software stack that's running on that kernel, and it works relatively nicely. So I think that's open by pretty much, I think, both of our definitions. That is an open design. So let's move on to further northbound. So I think this is where maybe we venture onto extensibility versus openness, where let's talk about SDKs, because I think they're worth talking about in this context, right? Where if you imagine a typical NOS that has a bunch of northbound interfaces and it has some kind of schema, and we'll talk about the schema just after this, but let's stick to SDKs. Would you consider NOSes that are providing some level of extensibility? I'll call it what it is. I think it's extensibility in a manner that somebody can take and kind of tune to their own liking or their own environment. Does that qualify as open to you, or is that extensible?
Maybe need a little bit more definition around that. So you're saying having an SDK that does what exactly?
Well, let's say you could inject routes into the fib, or I don't know, you could mess around with ACLs, or you could, subscribe for notifications, or...
But are you talking about providing an abstraction to an existing...
closed source application is what it would be, right? I have this closed source application and it performs a bunch of functions, essentially. Let's say BGP. And I now am providing you a method to interact with that process in a programmatic way that isn't through the normal configuration methods. So let's say...
I would call that extensible. That's extensible because now I can extend the capability of my typical network operating system to do something more. right? Because like you said, my normal interaction with BGP is through CLI or northbound interfaces that configure a data model, data structure around well understood BGP parameters. There isn't really a way for me to interact with it in any other fashion. Like for instance, subscribe to changes or maybe even inject routes into a RIB or something like that. If you offer that capability, you're allowing it to be extensible. Like you're allowing it for further usage of a BGP stack beyond what it typically was designed for within the realm of like RFCs and that sort of stuff. Because
Okay. Yeah.
right. So
Yeah,
now you're
okay,
extending it, and maybe you're allowing for some openness because maybe that this is where it gets a bit tricky because the difference between extensible and open now becomes a bit of a discussion point, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the whole discussion point is
Yeah.
like what if every single I don't know method or a function that process is making is exposed through that SDK.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think maybe that's that whole scope argument, right? Is if the scope is quite limited, then and there's always something that's hidden underneath the skirt, like you can see some, but you can't see everything. So I guess in that
Right.
context, that would lead to extensible. So SDKs into closed source applications, we're saying are not open by the definition that we just gave
Yeah,
before.
I'd say you're allowing for extensibility. You're allowing for a further use case onto an existing closed source system.
Okay. Yep. No disagreement. Maybe this won't be as long of a discussion.
Well, actually, let's just make this really confusing and jump back around to something. One big part of considering something open is that supportability, right? Because like I would say, for instance, we go back to the Arista example and the fact that it may or may not be able to run FRR and may or may not be running FRR for a specific customer. The fact that they don't support that for the wider market, even though they can technically it's doable, does that make it any less open than?
I think that's not open. I don't
It's
think
not
that's
open, right? So
Yep.
if you call it because the fact that the vendor in this particular case would not support that to the wider market, I don't know if they do or not. I don't want to. I'm not putting words into Arista's mouth. I don't know whether they.
Yeah,
Support
these
it
are
or
all
not,
theoreticals. These are all
yeah,
theoreticals.
I don't want to come across as like everybody's going to go call Arista. Hey, I want to run FR. No. So yeah. Okay. So that just wanted to clear that up. That a vendor, because that came up in discussion, was like, this friend of mine and I worked together on a product that with a vendor with a product that was built, had an application stack running on Linux on a bunch of Linux VMs, which meant inherently that I could run any other application on these Linux VMs if I wanted to from a technical standpoint. Clearly wasn't supported by the vendor's support system. And so, his point was, well, is that open or is that not open? But I think to me, it was pretty clear that if it's not supported, if it's not something that you can call up and be like, hey, my VM broke. And if they said, well, you're running the software and you shouldn't be running it, and therefore we don't support you, that inherently means that it's not open, even though it technically could run any application they wanted to because it was a CentOS or Red Hat based virtual machine.
So you think when there is an expectation of support, because I think in a lot of these other cases, there is no expectation of support, right? Unless you're paying for some kind of support contract, and you could take a. Actually, no. I'll wind that back. I was going to bring up Red Hat as an example, but Red Hat you need a license, and you need to pay for support
For Red Hat specifically, but that's another interesting model because their entire model is providing everything they do in open source and providing a supported model.
Yeah.
So they obviously they like ride that line of open source and closed, right? Because
yeah, but they typically don't disallow you from doing stuff within the
they're
OS,
pretty good.
right?
Yeah, they're pretty good. Exactly, they're pretty good at being. It's actually impressive. They're pretty good at and from a support perspective, it's impressive. They don't limit you on what you can do and what applications you run. They'll try and make sure that it's not their fault, and they'll support you as long as it's not something that they've done wrong or something like that. Right? They try and identify that. Whereas a lot of vendors, especially in the networking world, will just say, hey, no, like you install an application on this Linux VM, regardless of whether it has any impact on why the VM is not working, we're not going to support this. Like the ticket gets closed. You should not be running this application. And there'll be no research done into whether or not that application actually had any impact on the root cause of the problem that they caused in the first place. Whereas Red Hat, I see Red Hat is pretty good about letting you do that, like where you could run applications and they're not going to automatically close a ticket because you're running a non-Red Hat supported application on your
server that you're paying them to support.
That I know of. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean that does lead to an interesting point though, right? Because another part of that definition was the ability to take what you want and leave what you don't want. So would Red Hat allow you to rip out like I don't know, what's an example? OpenSSH, I guess, yes, no problem there. What about one of the more kind of Linux primitives? Like, I don't know, what if you wanted to run your own glibc or something like that?
I have absolutely no idea if they would let you do that or not. Yeah. It depends if they had any sort of Red Hat applications relying on that, maybe. Do you know, like if it has no impact to any Red Hat application and you've ripped it and replaced it with your own version of it because you have an application running on top of that server or whatever that needs to use your version of it, then and it doesn't affect them, then why would they care, right? But now if you're trying to run a Red Hat supported a database or something silly on top of that relies on that module, then they would have grounds to be like, well, that we've never tested this. This is not supported, you know. I think.
Yeah, I wonder if kind of the a little bit of a tangent, but I wonder if containers play an interesting role here, where those kind of you can remove or at least package a lot of those dependencies alongside your application, which makes the whole openness / extensibility conversation much easier, right? Because
way easier. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does make it easier. But you know where it doesn't make it easier is in a networking world. It makes the deployment of the application easier and the fact that you can run an application easier, but it doesn't, because there's so much interaction between the applications.
Yeah.
It makes it
this is only if you want to mess around with the applications your vendor is providing, right?
Yeah.
But by our definition of open, that's part of it, is being able to say, hey, your version of BGP sucks. Mine's better. FRR is king. Yeah. And I'm going to rip and replace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which honestly, to be realistic, the odds of that
craziness.
happening.
It's craziness. Yeah.
Well, no, I just think it's low. I just think the odds, like, unless you're like, you have to have a very specific reason why you'd want to do that. And I think that although it's doable, maybe with some vendors, maybe, and even then I would question it. Like I said, I mentioned Arista. I don't even know if they would be public about doing that. Yeah, I think that use case is pretty slim. I think if you're paying a vendor for a network operating system, you're probably okay with using whatever applications they're providing. In fact, you're probably looking for them to provide you with a stable routing stack, and you're not looking to rip and replace with FR unless you're like a very large provider in the world and you want to have.
If you're in development team, yeah. So I guess in that case, maybe being able to rip out applications isn't part of it, because I think a little bit of it is it's easy to market an operating system with a bunch of applications as a NOS, right? Because really it's like a Linux kernel with, I don't know, a Linux distribution like CentOS, and then a bunch of applications which are kind of bundled. And the whole thing is kind of packaged like an appliance. But if you didn't package it like an appliance, you could argue that what the vendor is providing you is just those applications and the other pieces happen to be free, essentially. The vendor doesn't charge you for them. In that case, the operating system itself is open, but you are running closed source applications on it.
Yeah. That'd be kind of cool, actually. I was thinking about it. If you shipped a switch with a Linux operating system and no networking functions as applications on it at all, and there was some mechanism that you just went and selected what applications you want to install as part of your ZTP process or your bootstrapping process, you actually went and installed whatever applications you wanted that were needed. I mean, like people wouldn't want that
style.
Yeah, exactly. Like you basically go like you were the server. Like in a server, you don't, you install an operating system, a base operating system, which is a lot of the times Linux these days. And then you go and install your applications. You're installing your database applications. You're installing your web applications, whatever it is you're installing. You do that. I mean, there's nothing stopping you from doing that from a technical and theoretical standpoint, from a networking perspective, if you have disaggregated applications and not a monolithic binary that runs all of your networking functions on a switch. I think it's probably far-fetched to think that a networking industry is going that way, but just from like, hey, that's kind of cool. Hey, that's kind of cool. You could, that's kind of cool. You could do that if you had.
It's an interesting thought experiment, but
and Sonic allows you to do that a bit, right?
It does. I mean, in the sense that it's possible, but I don't know if it's done. Like I know, Junos will run RPD, for example. Like Juniper will run RPD on top of Sonic. I think Arista has a model where they all run CEOS and they'll interact with the hardware and just provide like an abstraction layer below SCI. That's not really what we're talking about. Though.
No, that was completely side tangent. It is not at all what we're talking about. No. That was just a thought.
Yeah,
I don't have many of them, so I have to blurt them out when I have them.
No, I mean you should. You should speak loud, brother.
What were we talking about?
No, I mean,
By the way,
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we've come to an agreement on what open is, where open is the ability for you to have control, essentially, of the aspects of the underlying operating system. Whether or not you can take or leave things and still be supported, I think that depends on the support model, right? Like if the vendor is just supporting the applications and not supporting the appliance, then I think that works. But if they are supporting the appliance, I think it's probably a little bit more gray in the sense that, like, what happens if you rip out like Psy in Sonic, right, and replace that with something? I think given kind of how intrinsically linked a lot of applications are with syncd and asicdb, that's not really a model that Sonic would support per se. Now they get away with it because there's no support, right? So because it's open source.
But it wouldn't matter to anybody.
That's
in
true.
other words, if you decided to do that, you built your own Psy, your own abstraction layer, and it worked with Sonic. I mean, good on you. I mean, you can do that. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. Yeah. So,
okay, so let's go a level deeper than this, because there is one interesting aspect to Sonic itself, which is Psy, right? So the way Psy works is that ASIC vendors provide their kind of Psy library for their chip, and that library provides a bunch of APIs essentially that fit underneath Psy, and it's closed source.
Yeah, I mean, yes.
So
yes is my answer.
Yes.
Yes, but there's nothing stopping from any vendor to build that integration into Psy.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, Psy itself is open source, right? It's just the underlying kind of ASIC component is not. So, and it's packaged as a binary within Sonic, right? It's not like you can go look at the source code. So, is Sonic really open?
Yeah, I mean, yes is the answer, I would say.
Oh, dear. We have to build some contention, right?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I agree. Like I said, I think there's, even on a lot of implementations where we would consider things to be open, they may be using like closed source drivers, right? Like if you plug in an NVIDIA GPU into your Linux server, you have to run a closed source driver in a lot of cases to drive that GPU. You don't have to, but if you really want the most performance, it's what you do. So,
right.
I mean, I guess you could argue that that's not open.
But the fact that you don't have to, I mean, you want to because it's more performant. If there was an available open source version that was maybe less performant, you have that choice. It's open. You can either use the vendor supported one that maybe costs you a few dollars, or you can go and use the open source one. And if you have a use for the closed one that's more performant, you pay for it. But the fact that you can even make that decision, to me, means that you inherently have an open system.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right.
No, I mean, if you're relying and you can only have vendors, and it's like you don't have a choice, you basically take whatever is available, because that's all it's available, because that's all it's been developed, and you have to pay for it. That's not open. There's nothing open about that.
Yeah.
But having
I
a
guess.
choice makes it open.
Yeah, but you only have a choice because the GPU is exposing a set of APIs that those kind of open source drivers are tapping into, right?
Yeah, so
So
now you
it's
get back down
the
to API.
yeah,
I know,
exactly.
I get it. I see
Exactly.
where you're going with this. You're just
No,
trying to
I mean,
sneak back. You're trying to sneak back into that abstraction layer and having an API inherently meaning that it's open, or potentially meaning that it's open.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think the look, open is always going to be subjective, right? I think for sure, I would agree with your friend, whoever he was, that it does get thrown around as a marketing term too often, and really what people mean is extensible in a lot of cases. Now,
Agreed.
there's clear examples where things I would say are genuinely open. I mean, Sonic is an example, despite it having potentially closed source stuff in it when you're
Components.
running on
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
certain ASICs. And I think there are kind of some of those more typical big iron vendors that are taking interesting approaches to open, like Arista, if they are running FRR and that's a model that they've deployed with a customer, that sounds pretty open to me. Arista allows you to run applications. I think pretty much all the big vendors now allow you to run applications next to the system. The level of support, I guess that's something that we can only really speculate on, like what is allowed and what's not, and how isolated things have to be, and because it is challenging, right? Like, I mean, you and I both do work for a vendor, so the whole matrix of testing you have to do, and you're often pushing things to their very limits when you're doing multi-dimensional scale testing. So
Yeah.
having someone come in and run like some kind of headless application that is just chugging away at CPU cycles and consuming a bunch of memory typically means that you can't go, yes, we'll still do that scale.
Yeah, I mean, there's reasons to not be open, and they're legitimate reasons. That's not,
Yeah.
that's not a problem. I guess the crux of the discussion originally was claiming something open when it's just marketing, and it may not actually be open.
Right. Yeah.
And then it came at defining open, but
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. There's clearly a lot of that goes on, right? Just like people are throwing around this whole like intent-based networking,
yeah.
and not really
Or
doing.
or SDN 5 years ago, or even more than 5 years ago. The SDN was and everybody was doing SDN, and nobody knew what SDN meant.
Yeah.
I think intent-based networking is a little bit more focused than SDN, to be fair, but it's still used extensively in
way
places
too
where
much.
it probably shouldn't. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
way,
There's
way,
very
way,
few.
way too much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about one final thing before we
Okay.
wrap up. Which is and maybe it'll be short. It could be. But the whole concept of open schemas. So
Yes.
the obvious one is open config.
You mean the one?
Right?
I was going to say the one open schema.
There's IETF models as well. So there's two
That's
at
true,
least.
actually. Actually, that's true.
There's
That's true.
two
Good
at
point.
least.
Good point. There's two. There's two.
How do you think they have any place in this discussion at all, given we were discounting the whole abstraction layer, right? And really, these are just abstractions. In fact, they're in often cases worse than abstractions because they're abstractions on abstractions with a translation in the middle. So
Yes, in some cases.
do they fit into the conversation at all? I had made a note at the start to talk about open config in particular, but now that we've kind of defined open, maybe it doesn't fit. But I did want to bring it up just in case you had any thoughts.
No, it has a play in that the data model itself is open in the sense that it's open source to some extent, right? I mean, I can go and suggest changes to open config and in fact add a whole new data model for something, and as long as people agree, then we're good to go.
That's a good point. The model itself is open because it's open source.
Yeah.
You could argue that given it's all written in Yang and vendors even distribute their own proprietary models, right? They distribute them openly in the sense that they'll give you access to the Yang. So the models themselves are open,
but they're not
they're
open.
open source.
Well, no, you mean even vendor models?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, you can't
technically
do
there's
much
nothing
with them being open source. So
right,
maybe that
exactly.
is a key distinction.
So it kind of, exactly. So it kind of defeats the purpose. Because if I go into OpenConfig and I define a new model, my expectation by doing so is that I'm also in parallel talking to either my switch vendor or I have a development team that's working on my own hardware that will actually do something useful with that model. I'm not just going to go build a data model that's going to sit there and do nothing at all, right? I mean, there's a purpose behind it. And so inherently, if I go and extend and add and change my OpenConfig model, there's an assumption being made there that that's going to be implemented into something else beyond that, which may be by your vendor or by your dev team that's building, the network application. So that inherently is open. And I think that is a differentiation between a vendor model, because the vendor model is not open. I can't go make a change to the vendor model. I mean, I can, like you said, like technically I can go change the Yang models, the Yang file, but I'm not going to, that doesn't have any effect unless I go to the vendor and I make a, enhancement.
No, but the same thing applies to your OpenConfig example. Just by defining a model doesn't mean anything happens.
Right, but the intent is that it would. Like,
I mean, they're different. They're different for sure, in the sense that OpenConfig. I guess it is owned by the IETF now, isn't it? I think it is.
Really?
I think Google handed it over and said, "Here you go, run with this." But I could be wrong on that. I actually could be 100% wrong, given that there's still an IETF model, and I don't know why the IETF would take OpenConfig given they have their own model.
And I also thought that not the whole point, but one of the big drivers behind having OpenConfig versus the IETF model was the rate of change to those models. Whereas an IETF-based model is a slow process, exactly. And not the whole point, but one of the big drivers behind having a community-owned model like OpenConfig was the rate of change. So I mean, maybe they passed it over to IETF. It sounds to me like if you've done that, you've given up on the rate of changing it. But
yeah, I guess it's the getting vendors to adopt it part, right? That's kind of the challenging part that OpenConfig has kind of been struggling with. But that's another topic for probably another best effort podcast.
Yeah.
So I think we can wrap up. We know what open is now. It's not just open source, guys.
Correct. And I'd like to point out that I won that discussion over dinner. Yeah,
oh,
my
you
friends
did?
Are gonna listen to this. No, I didn't. But I mean, maybe I did. I know my friends are gonna listen to this, so I just want to throw that in there, so he knows who I'm talking about. When I'm talking to, he'll be very upset because it's a one-way discussion. Because I can just say this and he can't respond, and I won.
You won. Open is not open source.
Exactly.
All right, I think we can wrap up.
Let's wrap it up.
All right, thanks for listening, guys, and I guess cue the outro.
Yeah, cue the outro. We're just going to tell you to let us know what you think, but really let us know what you think. What does open mean to you?
Yeah, what does open mean to you? Does it need to be open source, right?
Is it overused by vendors or anybody else? Is the term open overused from a marketing standpoint? Yes is the answer.
All right. Well, we'll be interested to hear your feedback. Thanks for listening. And for real, we're going to cue the outro now. Peace.
Bye.
Hey, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in. As always, please do let us know any feedback or criticisms you may have. We can be reached on Twitter, YouTube, or our website, ntwr.kn, where you'll find this episode and many others posted. For those of you on YouTube, if you liked the episode, please hit that thumbs up button. And if you didn't like the episode, feel free to hit the thumbs down button twice. On a side note, you know those cliche, "these are our opinions and not that of our employer" statements you hear all the time? Yeah, we unfortunately have to make one of those. The benefits of working in the industry we want to publicly have an opinion about. We've done our best to remove bias, but we're only human and we make mistakes just like you. Thanks again. We'll see you in the next one.